In this lesson, we're learning about doubles in PHP, which represent numbers with decimal points, also known as floating point numbers. In this example, we're exploring one of the most important numeric data types in PHP, the double, also known as a floating point number. Doubles are used when we need to represent numbers that contain a decimal point, such as 3.1459 or 49.1. These types of numbers are especially useful when performing calculations that require precision, like financial computations, scientific measurements, or any calculation that isn't limited to whole numbers. By default, PHP automatically prints double values with only the minimum number of decimal places required. This means that if your number includes unnecessary zeros after the decimal point, PHP will remove those zeros when displaying it. For instance, if you write the number 3.141592, PHP displays it as 3.148159. Similarly, 49,000 becomes 49.1. This automatic rounding and formatting make your output cleaner and easier to read, without losing any important accuracy. Now, let's carefully look at the code snippet 6 shown in the image. The first line defines a variable named many, which holds the value 2.28t800. The second line defines another variable, many2, with the value 2.2111,200. Although both numbers include several trailing zeros, PHP internally stores them in a precise floating point format. When printed on the screen, however, those extra zeros are removed to keep the output neat and readable. In the next line, a third variable named few is created. This variable stores the sum of many and many2. In other words, PHP adds 2.2888 and 2.2112 and stores the result, which is approximately 4.5, inside the few variable. Finally, we see a print statement that displays the result in a descriptive format. The code prints a string that combines both numbers and the calculated sum. So the output on the screen will look something like this: 2.288 plus 2.21112. 4.5. Notice how PHP doesn't show all those unnecessary trailing zeros from the original values. This behavior reflects PHP's built-in efficiency with floating point numbers. It always ensures that the displayed result is as short as possible, yet accurate enough to represent the true value. This example perfectly demonstrates how doubles behave in PHP, maintaining mathematical accuracy while automatically optimizing the way numbers are presented. This feature becomes particularly valuable in real-world applications such as finance, statistics, and engineering, where clean numeric output is crucial. Understanding how doubles work helps developers write programs that not only perform precise calculations, but also present results in a clear, readable, and professional format. Now let's look at the output of the PHP code from the previous example. When the program runs, PHP performs the arithmetic operation between the two double values, 2.2k88 and 2.2112, and then displays their sum. The output, as shown here, is 2.288 plus 2.2112, me 4.5. This result confirms that PHP not only performs the calculation accurately, but also automatically optimizes the number format. You'll notice that the output does not show any unnecessary zeros. Even though the original values had several trailing zeros like 2.288,800 and 2.211,200, instead, PHP prints them in their simplified and most readable form. In this case, both numbers add up to a clean, precise result of 4.5, which again is displayed using the minimum required decimal places. This behavior highlights one of PHP's key advantages when dealing with floating point or double values. It ensures precision in computation while maintaining clarity in presentation. The lower part of the image visually represents this: calculation using simple icons, a calculator, symbol, and a plus sign to reinforce that the operation being demonstrated is basic. Arithmetic using double data types. This visual style helps make the concept more intuitive, especially for beginners learning PHP programming. The text, PHP arithmetic, example at the bottom serves as a reminder that this output isn't just about formatting, It's a demonstration of how PHP handles mathematical operations involving decimals behind the scenes. In real-world programming, this principle is incredibly useful. When you perform calculations involving prices, measurements, or percentages, you want your output to remain both accurate and readable. PHP's double data type ensures that your program outputs clean, professional-looking results without unnecessary digits cluttering the screen. The output shown here, 2.2888 plus 2.2112 equals 4.5, is a perfect example of how PHP processes and presents double precision arithmetic in a clear and efficient way. In the previous code example, we saw how two floating point numbers were added together, and the result was stored inside a variable called few. This simple arithmetic operation demonstrates how the double data type in PHP behaves when handling decimal numbers. It clearly shows that PHP automatically displays only the necessary number of decimal places, keeping the output neat and easy to read while maintaining full mathematical accuracy. Now, moving forward from numeric data types, let's explore another important concept in PHP, the Boolean data type. Booleans are the simplest and most fundamental form of data in programming. You can think of them as a digital version of a light switch. They can only be in one of two possible states, on or off, true or false, or in numeric terms, 1 or 0. A Boolean variable can hold only one value at a time, either true, which represents a correct or positive condition, or false, which represents an incorrect or negative condition. This makes Booleans extremely useful when writing programs that involve decision-making or logic checks. In PHP, Booleans are most commonly used with conditional statements, such as if and else. When a condition inside an if statement evaluates to true, PHP executes the block of code inside that condition. If the condition is false, the code inside is skipped, and the program moves on to the next part. For example, you might have a simple Boolean condition that checks whether a user is logged in. If the condition returns true, PHP can display a welcome message. But if it returns false, it can redirect the user to the login page. This shows how Booleans help programs make smart, automatic decisions. In short, Booleans act as the logical backbone of programming. They allow the program to think, to test whether something is right or wrong, and then respond accordingly. As mentioned in the image, Code Snippet 7 will demonstrate a small PHP program that shows how Boolean values are used in action, helping you understand exactly how true and false control the flow of a script. Now, let's move on to Code Snippet 7, which clearly demonstrates how Boolean conditions work in PHP. In this simple example, two if statements are written one after the other. The first line checks the condition if, true, and the second checks if, false. Inside each block, there's an echo statement, which is used to display text on the screen. Let's understand this step by step. When PHP reads the first condition, if true, it immediately recognizes that the condition is logically true. Because this condition evaluates to true, PHP executes the code inside the block and displays the message, "This condition is true," on the screen. Next, PHP reaches the second condition, if false. Since this condition is false, the statement inside it is ignored. That means the text, "This condition is false," will not appear in the output. Because the false block never gets executed, as a result, the only output that appears when this code runs is, "This condition is true." On the right side of the image, it's explained that when a Boolean value is true, PHP executes the block immediately. If no additional logic or comparison is included in the program, PHP will simply evaluate the Boolean expression as it is. True will always execute, and false will always be skipped. This is an important foundation of conditional logic in programming. It shows that Booleans act as decision-makers inside a program. They tell PHP whether or not to run certain sections of code based on the condition's truth value. So, in simple terms, whenever the condition evaluates to true, the code inside that block is executed. And whenever it evaluates to false, the code inside is ignored. Finally, the image shows the output result, confirming that only the first line, "This condition is true," is printed on the screen. This output proves that the true block ran successfully while the false block was skipped. This small example may look simple, but it represents the core logic system behind every major program, from log invalidation to automated trading systems. Booleans form the basic logic gates that decide what happens next inside a PHP program. Now that we've learned how Boolean values work in PHP, controlling logical flow using true or false, let's move on to another important data type called NULL. The null data type in PHP is special because it represents the absence of any value. In other words, when a variable doesn't hold any data, or when it has been explicitly set to have no value, PHP assigns it the value null. A variable with a null value simply means that it exists, but it doesn't currently store any information. Think of it as an empty box. The box is still there, but there's nothing inside it. In PHP, the null value is always written in uppercase letters, NULL, because PHP treats it as a case-sensitive keyword. That means writing null in lowercase won't work the same way as writing null in uppercase. If you create a variable without assigning it any value, PHP automatically gives it the value null by default. For example, if you write myvar, without assigning anything to it, PHP will treat it as myvar a null. It's also important to note that in a Boolean context, a null value behaves as false. That means if you use a null variable inside an if statement, the condition will not be true, because PHP interprets null as a non-existent or empty value. The image also shows the basic syntax for assigning a null value. myvar, null. Here, myvar is declared as a variable and it's being explicitly assigned a null value, meaning it currently holds nothing. This concept becomes very useful in situations where you need to reset a variable or clear its value without deleting it from memory. For example, after processing some data, you can assign null to the variable to ensure it no longer holds outdated or sensitive information. At the bottom of the image, it mentions that code snippet 8 will demonstrate a PHP program showing how the null data type works in practice. This example will make it easier to understand how null interacts with other data types and how it behaves when used inside conditional statements. The null data type in PHP represents emptiness. It doesn't mean zero. It doesn't mean false. It simply means no value. It's a key concept that helps developers handle variables that are intentionally left empty or waiting to receive data later in the program. Now let's look closely at code snippet 8, which demonstrates how the null data type behaves in PHP. In this example, a variable named NNL is declared and explicitly assigned the value null. This means that the variable exists, but it does not hold any actual data. It's completely empty. PHP recognizes this as a variable that has no assigned value. Next, the echo statement is used to try to display the value of nil. However, since NL is null, PHP doesn't have anything to print. That's why this line produces no visible output on the screen. You can also see a comment written beside the code, "It will not give any output," which clearly indicates that echoing a NULL variable doesn't display anything. This is because null represents the absence of value, not zero, not false, and not even an empty string. It's simply nothing. In PHP, this behavior is intentional. When a variable is null, it tells the program that the variable exists but has not been assigned meaningful data yet. This is different from assigning an empty string because an empty string is still considered a value, just a blank one. Null, on the other hand, means no value at all. The message written below the code explains this perfectly. In code snippet 8, since the variable has been assigned with a null value, there is no output. This is one of the simplest yet most powerful examples of how PHP treats the null data type. It helps programmers handle situations where they might want to clear a variable, reset its data, or prepare it to receive information later in the program. For instance, imagine you're writing a program that connects to a database. At the start, you might set the connection variable to null because there's no active connection yet. Once the program successfully connects, that variable can then be updated to hold the connection details. This is a common real-world use of NULL, to define the state of a variable before it actually stores any real data. In code snippet 8, PHP creates a variable lnl, assigns it the null value, and then when Echo tries to print it, nothing appears on the screen because the variable holds no actual content. This perfectly demonstrates how null in PHP represents the complete absence of value while still keeping the variable itself active and ready for use. Now that we've covered the null data type, let's move on to one of the most commonly used data types in PHP, the string. A string is simply a sequence of characters, like letters, numbers, or symbols enclosed within quotes. In programming, strings are mainly used to represent textual information, such as names, messages, or sentences. For example, when you print text like "Hello World" or "Welcome to PHP," you're using a string. In PHP, each character in a string occupies 1 byte of memory. This means PHP strings are based on the 256-character ASCII set, and not the full Unicode character set that supports international languages. However, PHP can still handle Unicode text using special extensions or encoding functions. In 32-bit systems, a PHP string can have a maximum size of about 2 gigabytes. That's a huge limit, enough for most web applications. Now there are 4 different ways you can define a string in PHP, and each has its own unique use case. Single-quoted strings. When you enclose your text inside single quotes, Asher. PHP treats everything inside as plain text. That means variables or escape sequences like ondan or jut-t are not interpreted. For example, hello name will be printed exactly as it is, showing name as plain text instead of inserting a variable's value. Double-quoted strings. When you use double quotes, PHP automatically interprets variables and special characters inside the string. So, hello name will display the actual value of name. Similarly, special escape sequences like NN for new lines or HT for tabs will work inside double quotes. This makes double-quoted strings more flexible and dynamic than single-quoted ones. Heredoc syntax. The Heredoc syntax is especially useful when working with long text blocks, like paragraphs, HTML templates, or email messages, where you don't want to manually add quotes and concatenation symbols. It starts with 3 less than signs followed by an identifier like, for example, extraver, pos. In this format, PHP still interprets variables and escape sequences, just like in double quotes. Nowdoc syntax. The Nowdoc syntax is very similar to Heredoc, but it works more like single quotes. That means the content inside is treated as plain text. Variables and escape sequences are not processed. The Nowdoc syntax begins with label and ends with the same label name. This is perfect when you want to include raw code or text exactly as it is, without PHP interpreting anything inside it. In short, single and double quotes are great for short strings, while Heredoc and Nowdoc are designed for multi-line text blocks or large templates. Together, they give developers a flexible way to handle any kind of text content, whether static or dynamic. Now that we've explored how strings work in PHP, let's move forward to another essential programming concept, variable scope. In PHP, every variable that you create has something called a scope, which determines where that variable can be accessed in your program. In simple terms, scope defines the visibility and lifetime of a variable, or, in other words, where your variable exists and where it can be used. Just like in most programming languages, PHP organizes variable visibility into 3 main types of scope: local, global, and static. Let's look at each one carefully. Local scope. A variable that is declared inside a function has a local scope. That means it can only be accessed or used within that specific function where it was created. Outside of that function, PHP doesn't recognize it. It simply doesn't exist. For example, if you declare count basher 5 inside a function, you cannot use count outside that function. It is visible only within that function's boundaries. This is helpful because it keeps variables isolated, preventing conflicts with other parts of the code. Global scope A global variable, on the other hand, is declared outside any function. This makes it accessible throughout the entire PHP script in any part of your program. However, there's one important detail. You cannot directly access a global variable from inside a function unless you explicitly declare it as global within that function. For instance, if you have a global variable x10 defined outside and you want to use it inside a function, you must use the global keyword, like this. Function show value. Global AX, echo directs. This tells PHP that the AX inside the function refers to the same variable AX declared globally outside. So, global variables are powerful, but they must be used carefully. Too many globals can make your code harder to maintain. Static scope. Now comes the static variable, which is quite interesting. Normally, when a function is executed, any variables declared inside it are destroyed once the function finishes running. But if you declare a variable using the static keyword, PHP remembers its value even after the function has ended. This means that when the function is called again, the static variable retains its previous value instead of resetting. For example, function counter and static num is 0. Num++, echo num. If you call this function multiple times, the output will be 1, then 2, then 3, because num keeps its value between calls. Static scope is very useful when you need a function to remember previous data without using global variables. Local variables exist only inside functions. Global variables exist everywhere in the script, but must be declared global inside functions to be accessed. And static variables exist inside a function but retain their value between multiple executions of that function. Understanding variable scope is extremely important for writing clean, efficient, and bug-free PHP code. It helps you control how data flows through your program and prevents unwanted interference between different parts of your script. Now that we understand how variable scope works in PHP, let's take a deeper look at one specific type of scope, the global scope, and how we can access global variables inside functions using the global keyword. In PHP, when you declare a variable outside of any function, it automatically becomes a global variable. This means that it can be accessed from anywhere in your script, except directly inside a function. By default, functions in PHP have their own local environment, so global variables declared outside are not automatically visible inside them. To solve this, PHP provides a special keyword called global. If you want to use a global variable inside a function, you simply add the global keyword before the variable name inside that function. For example, imagine you have a variable x10 declared outside the function. Normally, if you try to use x inside a function, PHP won't recognize it because the function can't see variables outside its own scope. But if you write function test, global x, echo x, now x becomes available inside the function. When you call test, PHP will correctly print the value of AX, which is 10. In simple terms, adding the global keyword connects the local function scope to the global variable defined outside it. However, there's another interesting thing to know. In PHP, all global variables are automatically stored inside a special superglobal array called globals. This array holds every global variable in your program, and each one can be accessed using its variable name as an index. For example, the globals refers to the same global variable x. This means you can also use globals to access or modify global variables directly, even from inside functions, without needing to write the global keyword. For example, function test, echo globals. This will output the same value as before, 10. The globals array is especially useful in larger PHP applications where you need to access or update global data across multiple functions, files, or classes. To summarize this section, global variables are declared outside functions and are accessible everywhere in the script. But if you want to use them inside a function, You must either use the global keyword to bring them into the local function scope, or use the globals array to reference them directly by name. The image here visually represents this concept. The global globe icon represents a variable with global visibility, and the code snippet shows how to access it within a function using global AX. This simple concept is essential when you want your functions to share or modify data that exists outside their local scope, a common need in dynamic PHP programs. And that brings us to the end of this PHP tutorial segment. We've explored how PHP handles different data types, from doubles, Booleans, and null values to strings and variable scope, including how global, local, and static variables function behind the scenes. We also learned how to use the global keyword and the special globals array to manage data across functions. Each of these concepts plays an essential role in building dynamic, powerful, and efficient PHP programs. Understanding how data is stored, accessed, and controlled within your code is what separates beginner programmers from confident developers who truly understand the logic of a system. Now, before we wrap up, here's a quick reminder. If you found this explanation helpful and you're learning something new today, make sure to stay connected with Huzaifa TV Official. Stay informed, stay inspired, and continue learning every day with the Huzaifa TV Official family. Don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed the lesson, comment your thoughts or questions below, share this with your friends who are learning programming, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next educational update. Thank you for watching. This is Huzaifa TV Official, where knowledge meets inspiration.